Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to our webinar today on human trafficking and immigration status, options and challenges for trafficked persons, which is hosted by METRAC, Action on Violence, guest speaker, immigration lawyer Silmi Abdullah from the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. My name is Andrea Collins Fitzpatrick, and I'm the legal director for METRAC's Community Justice Program. I would like to first start with a disclaimer by reminding you that this webinar is for general information purposes only and is not legal advice. The legal information provided is not intended to be used as legal advice for a specific legal problem. This webinar will be recorded and reflects developments in the law before October 19, 2021. If everyone could please mute their microphones, that would be great. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement this afternoon. We acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people living on this land. We recognize the traditional territories on which our organization is located and on which our programs and training take place. Before I move to our presenter this afternoon, I would like to tell you a bit about METRAC. METRAC works to end gender-based violence across communities through education, research, and policies. We have been in existence since 1984, and our programs are devoted to advancing safety, justice, and equity. METRAC's Community Justice Program provides legal education and information related to gender-based violence. Through our Access to Justice program, we provide legal information in areas of family law, immigration law, criminal law, employment law, and human rights law. This webinar is part of our Family Law Education for Women and Flu series. Flu's resources are available in 14 languages, ASL, videos, and accessible formats. You can visit our website at onefamilylaw.ca for more information on your family law matters. I'm very excited today to have Silmi Abdullah to speak to us about human trafficking and immigration status. Before I introduce Silmi, I would just like to thank Kenny Ann, our Justice Program Coordinator, for running the PowerPoint today, and our technician, Brian. Silmi Abdullah is a staff lawyer at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, SALCO. Her practice focuses on the intersection of immigration, poverty, and gender-based violence. She's a passionate advocate who has spoken on important human rights issues on numerous platforms, including community workshops, mainstream media, the Parliament of Canada, and conferences in Canada and overseas. Before I hand you over to Silmi, I would like to remind you that we will have a Q&A after the presentation. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. We also have a survey that we would please like you to fill out, and it will be posted in the chat towards the end of the presentation. Please enjoy the presentation, and thank you again for being here. I'll now pass things on to Silmi. Over to you, Silmi.
Thanks, Andrea, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on human trafficking and immigration status. And we'll be talking about what some of the challenges are for trafficked people and what's some of the options that they have under immigration law. So before I begin, I want to start by telling you a little bit about SALCO, South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. So we are a community legal clinic that's funded by Legal Aid Ontario. We are a specialty clinic that serves low-income South Asians, for example, people originating from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, in the GTA. We are located at 45 Shepherd Avenue East, although at this point we are all working remotely, but you are able to reach us at the number that's provided here if you require legal advice or representation. So we assist in primarily in immigration matters and also some employment and human rights issues and income security. We do not provide advice or representation in criminal or civil law, but we do provide basic legal advice on family law, especially in cases of domestic violence, but we don't represent people in family law. So just a quick run through of what we're going to be talking about today. So very briefly, we're going to be talking about what human trafficking is, what's actually happening in Canada with respect to human trafficking, and what the legal framework is. So what does the law say about human trafficking in Canada? Then we're going to be moving into the intersection of human trafficking and immigration status. So we will be talking about the different vulnerabilities and the precarity that victims or survivors of human trafficking face with respect to immigration status in Canada, and what are some of the options. So we're specifically going to be talking about programs under immigration law, including the open work permit for vulnerable workers, the temporary resident permit for victims of trafficking, and refugee claims and humanitarian and compassionate applications, or also known as HNCs. And I'm going to be going into more detail about each of those programs. So in terms of what human trafficking is, very briefly, it is a crime that involves controlling and exploiting people by forcing them to do things for the benefit of someone else. So it can involve forcing people to work in inhumane conditions with little or no pay, which is also known as labor trafficking. It can involve forcing people to provide sexual services or sex trafficking. And actually, we'll talk about this as well. Domestic sex trafficking is very prevalent in Canada, especially when it comes to young women and girls, and particularly racialized women and Indigenous women and girls, which involves, the involvement or the forcing of young women and girls into the sex trade. Forced marriage is also something that could overlap with human trafficking, and also selling of organs. So this would involve, the trafficker approaching somebody, a very poor family who is looking for some money. And so they agree to sell their organs. And what the trafficker would do is then approach someone who's looking for the organs and charge them exorbitant amount of money to obtain the organs. And then what they would do is keep most of the money and probably not give any money to the person who has provided the organs. So, and we actually don't have any known cases of organ or trafficking that involves selling of organs in Canada, but the other three we definitely see in Canada. Traffickers will use different tactics such as force, threats, manipulation, blackmailing, etc., to make trafficked people do things against their will. And it also involves moving people from one place to another or keeping them in a secret place. So those are some of the main elements of human trafficking. And we're going to go into the legal definition shortly. With respect to types of human trafficking, there are two types. So there's domestic, which is when the entire crime occurs inside a country's border, and that's called domestic trafficking. And that can actually happen to anyone regardless of immigration status. It could happen to citizen, permanent residents, or people with precarious immigration status. International trafficking happens when the person is transported from one country to another. So that this requires the crossing of at least one international border. And this impacts mostly people, migrant workers, or people who are coming in to work in Canada temporarily. So this is where, the precarious immigration status issue comes up most often. And we're going to be talking about this in more detail shortly. So in Canada, human trafficking actually it could happen to anybody, happens to men, women, and children, but it mostly happens to women and girls. So contrary to what we might think, that human trafficking happens in some far off country, it's actually not true. Human trafficking is very prevalent in Canada. And people who are at risk include, as I mentioned, Indigenous women and girls, immigrant community members, LGBTQ persons with disabilities, children in the child welfare system, or at-risk youth, and those facing poverty. And of course, these all intersect, right? These groups intersect. You cannot really look at them in silos. And the problem with human trafficking is that it's really difficult to assess the full extent of the crime. So the statistics and the numbers we have is not even a true reflection of actually what's happening because of its hidden nature and the number of barriers that people face in reporting and the difficulty of identifying victims for that reason. So a lot of times victims or survivors will not come forward because the trafficker has threatened them to deport them from Canada, or they've confiscated their documents, or they've told them that they will hurt their family members, or they have language barriers, or they simply don't have knowledge of their legal rights. So there are a lot of factors that make it really hard to understand what the true extent of the problem is. So according to the Department of Justice Canada, human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation is actually more prevalent in Canada, and a large number of human trafficking cases are related to domestic sex trafficking. So it's actually happening within the country. And on the whole, there were just under 1,400 victims of human trafficking reported by police in Canada between 2009 and 2018. And this is just police reported cases, right? And of these victims, women and girls comprise the vast majority, which is 97%. And as I was mentioning before, although anyone can be a victim of labor trafficking, in Canada, trafficking for the purposes of labor has mostly affected migrant workers who come to work temporarily from other countries. In terms of the legal framework, so I want to start by telling you a little bit about what international law says about human trafficking. So in the year 2000, the United Nations General Assembly adopted what's known as the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. So this is called the Palermo Protocol, and it's part of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, also known as the Palermo Convention. So this actually provides a global definition of human trafficking, and it says that trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion or abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. So, and exploitation, under this definition, exploitation includes sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. So if we break down this definition, you'll see that there are three elements to the definition of human trafficking. So there's the action element, and then there's the means by which these actions are carried out and the purpose for which these actions are carried out. So the actions will include things like recruiting somebody, transporting somebody, transferring somebody, keeping somebody in a secret place. So those are some of the actions. And the means by which the trafficker will do these things includes, again, using threat, force, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, etc. And exploitation will include, as I mentioned, things like sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, forced marriage, removal of organs. Those are some of the big ones. Now, if we move from the international framework and go into domestic law in Canada, so human trafficking is a crime under Canada's criminal law, and it is defined in the Criminal Code of Canada, which is the federal law that defines most criminal offenses in Canada. So these are the sections that deal with human trafficking under the Criminal Code. So there are four offenses. So one is trafficking in persons, which is the main offense. There's also trafficking of person under the age of 18 years, which makes it a crime to traffic somebody who's under the age of 18. There's the material benefit offense, which makes it a crime to knowingly get money or other benefits from trafficking someone, including trafficking someone who's under 18. And it's also a crime to withhold or destroy somebody's documents, the person who's being trafficked, to destroy their documents or withhold those documents. And there are actually other offenses related to human trafficking as well. So under the criminal code, so there's prostitution-related offenses, threats, assault, assaulting with a weapon. So I've just created a list here so that you can see what the, I guess, intersections are between the different offenses and the actual offense of human trafficking under the criminal code. So under criminal law, the definition, similar to the international law definition, there are three elements. So there's the act and the means and the purpose. So Section 279.01, which is the main offense, states that it's a crime to recruit somebody to move them or transfer them, to keep them or hide them, control them, or direct or influence their movements, to exploit them or facilitate their exploitation. So you'll see that there are the three elements of the action, the means by which the actions are carried out, and the purpose, which is the exploitation. Human trafficking is also a crime under immigration law, Canada's immigration law, and the main piece of legislation is the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, also known as the ARPA. And that is also federal legislation that applies across Canada. And the definition of human trafficking can be found in Section 118 of the ARPA. And the offense is called trafficking in persons. So under the immigration law definition, it says that it's an offense to organize the entry of someone in Canada through fraud, deception, use of force or coercion, or the threat of force or coercion. And the ARPA, under the ARPA, the term organize means recruiting somebody, transporting somebody, or receiving or harboring someone after their entry into Canada. The interesting thing about the immigration definition is it doesn't really mention anything about exploitation. So unlike the criminal law definition and the UN definition, which clearly mentioned exploitation, immigration law doesn't really mention the word exploitation. But what is required under the immigration law definition is the crossing of a border. So the immigration law definition talks about international human trafficking specifically. And if someone is found guilty of human trafficking under immigration law, they can face a maximum fine of $1 million or life imprisonment or both. Now, when it comes to reporting human trafficking, a trafficked person can come into contact with the criminal justice system if they report to the police themselves or if they're identified through a police investigation. And anyone can report a trafficking situation to the police. So it could be a member of the public, it could be a service provider, or the trafficked person themselves. But from a service provider's perspective, I think it's very important to make sure that if there is a report that's being made to the police, that the trafficked person gives consent to contact the police. Now, if there's immediate danger, you can call 911 or your local police service. And there's also the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, which is a confidential multilingual service that operates 24/7 to connect victims and survivors with social services, law enforcement, and emergency services, as well as receive tips from the public. So now I'd like to move into the immigration law portion of this presentation, where we talk specifically about immigration status, how a trafficked person could potentially fall into a situation where their immigration status is precarious, and what the options are, what some of the options are for them under immigration law. So, as I mentioned earlier, immigration status is a concern mostly in international labor trafficking cases. So these are cases where a migrant worker comes from a different country to work on a temporary basis. So they could there are a few scenarios that could fall under this. So they could arrive on a valid work permit and then exploited once they're in Canada. They could arrive through false or fraudulent documents, or they could arrive under another program, for example, a visitor visa, but forced to perform unauthorized work. So if you come to Canada under a visitor visa, you're actually not authorized to work. But oftentimes the traffickers, what they will do is they will bring someone on a visitor visa and then force them to work illegally or without a work permit. So there was actually a case in BC where a woman was brought into the country. She was promised a job in relation to caring for a family. And she was told that she came here under a valid work permit, but actually she was brought here under a visitor visa. And then she was told by the recruiter that she would get days off, and then she would have control over her documents, for example, her passport. But once she came here, she discovered that she didn't have any time off. She was working day and night. Her passport was confiscated. And she also discovered that she actually never had a valid work permit. She was brought here on a visitor visa. So when her visa expired, that gave another reason to the recruiter to exploit her by threatening her with deportation. So that's the scenario. And migrant workers who come to Canada under the temporary foreign worker program are especially vulnerable to human trafficking. And we're going to talk specifically about the temporary foreign worker program very shortly. And I do want to mention that labor trafficking and sex trafficking can often overlap. So a person can be promised to be brought here to work for a specific job, but once they come here, they can be exploited and forced into the sex trade and sexually exploited. So that can definitely happen. And as I mentioned before, there are certain vulnerabilities to exploitation. So poverty, lack of knowledge of legal rights, language barriers, fear of deportation, all of those things make a person specifically vulnerable to being exploited. Now, let's look a bit more closely at the temporary foreign worker program. So this is a specific program under immigration law for migrant workers to come to Canada to work temporarily to fill a temporary labor and skill shortage when Canadian citizens or permanent residents are not available. So it allows Canadian employers to hire foreign nationals to fill that gap. And this is actually a program where migrant workers are extremely vulnerable to exploitation. This program often includes farm workers and caregivers. So the way the temporary foreign worker program works is that the employer must apply for and receive a labor market impact assessment from Employment and Social Development Canada, also known as the LMIA, which essentially what this assessment is it involves assessing whether there is a shortage for that job, with respect to Canadian citizens and permanent residents being able to do that work, and whether getting somebody from outside Canada to fill that gap would negatively impact Canada's labor market. So the employer has to show that they have made reasonable efforts, but they've been unable to either hire or train Canadian citizens or permanent residents. And after a positive or neutral LMIA is granted, the migrant worker has to apply to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, for a work permit. Once they get the work permit, or once they're approved for the work permit, they get the permit from the Canada Border Services Agency at the port of entry. And then the employer and the worker has to must submit a signed employment contract. So the ways in which exploitation can happen under this program include, dishonest recruiters reaching out to the workers outside of Canada and promising them certain jobs and certain job conditions. And then what they often will do is charge high recruitment fees to the workers who want to work here. And the workers will often go on debt to arrange for the money and come to Canada with a huge debt burden. And so once they come here, they will often find themselves in a different job or with a different employer. And what they often end up doing is because they're coming to Canada with such a huge debt, they become trapped in exploitative conditions trying to repay those fees. So they're working long hours in very inhumane conditions because they have to repay those fees. And that also gives the opportunity to the employer to continue to exploit them. And that also involves, their travel documents being confiscated and threats of deportation. And sometimes they don't even, it's not even the case that, they don't have status. They may have legal status, but because they're not aware of their legal rights, the employer will threaten them with deportation and the worker will simply believe them. So the recruitment fees that the recruiters will often charge these workers they're actually illegal. So under the Employment Protection for Foreign Nationals Act, recruiters are prohibited from charging any kind of fee to migrant workers for any service, whether it's direct or indirect. So any fees that they charge for finding or attempting to find work for the person, helping them with resume writing, interview preparation, helping them with their immigration matters, if they're charging them for these services, they're all illegal. Now, the recruiters can charge these fees to the employers, but they cannot ask the employers to collect those fees then from the migrant worker. And that's often what recruiters in trafficking situations will do. They will charge the fees to the employers, but then they'll have them collected from the migrant worker. Now, under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, the work permit is actually, in many cases, it's tied to one employer. So that's also known as a closed work permit. So an open work permit will allow you to work for any employer. But if you come here on a closed work permit, you're only allowed to work for the employer that's indicated on your work permit and the specific job that you are supposed to do under that work permit. So if you work for a different employer than the one that's listed on the work permit, then you're actually in violation of your permit. So this often traps people in abusive situations, because if they try to leave their employer and work for somebody else, then they're in violation of their work permit. And if they try to speak out against the abuse that they're facing, that could mean that they lose their job and potentially their status in Canada. Now, if their employment is terminated, that doesn't automatically mean that they lose their status in Canada. They're allowed to stay in Canada for as long as their work permit is valid. But the situation of poverty and the debt they might have to repay might cause them to look for work with other employers, which then jeopardizes their status. And to work for a different employer, they would actually have to apply for a new work permit from inside Canada, which becomes very onerous for somebody who is in an abusive or exploitative situation. Now, aside from the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, there are also people who are out of status, right? So non-status people whose work permit may have expired, they may have overstayed their visitor visa, they may have made a refugee claim, but that claim might have failed and now they're under a removal order. Or it could be somebody who was sponsored to Canada by a spouse or partner and the sponsorship broke down and now there's no immigration application and they find themselves without status. So in those kinds of situations, it becomes much easier for an employer to exploit them because there's that constant threat of deportation, right? So a lot of people find themselves working under the table, and then the employer will tell them, well, if you try to leave or if you try to speak out, then I will contact the immigration authorities and you'll be removed from the country. Now, in terms of the options that are available for people who may be in exploitative situations, there is a program called Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers. So this work permit is specifically for migrant workers in Canada who have valid employer-specific work permits. So it's for people who have closed work permits, who are either experiencing abuse or who are at risk of abuse in relation to their work. And what this work permit does is it allows them or helps them to leave their current employer and gives them authorization to work for other employers. So normally there's a fee involved in applying for a work permit, but if you're a migrant worker who is experiencing abuse or at risk of abuse, then you don't have to pay an application fee for this permit specifically. And you're also not required to obtain an LMIA, or you don't have to have an offer of employment. You can go ahead and apply for the open work permit. The problem with this, actually, I have a slide specifically dedicated to problems. So I will wait to talk about what some of the challenges are with respect to this program. So some of the examples of abuse in the context of an application for an open work permit for vulnerable workers include illegal fees that are charged based on false promises or misleading information about a job. So that's something we specifically see in trafficking situations, right? Harassment and threats, forcing or pressurizing someone to work against work permit conditions, or someone who's at risk of abuse because their coworkers are in an abusive situation. So the thing to keep in mind is that it's not only relevant to people who are facing abuse, but who are also at the risk of abuse. Abuse is also defined, specifically in the context of COVID-19. There are some other factors that can be taken into account to assess whether somebody is facing abuse. So this could include wages, unpaid wages during quarantine or isolation period, or if somebody's forced to do work that violates quarantine, forced to work when somebody's showing COVID symptoms, or restricting somebody's movement, preventing them from getting medical help, or retaliation for taking sick leave or refusing to work in unsafe conditions, or forced to work with workers who should be in quarantine. So those are some examples specifically in the context of COVID-19. So you can apply for this work permit online, and when you're making the application, you have to include a letter of explanation that details the abuse or risk of abuse or any other supporting evidence of the abuse. If a worker has left an abusive employment situation before applying for this work permit, they're still eligible, but the caveat is that there's work permit, the employer-specific work permit, which they originally had, still has to be valid. Right? So they cannot apply if their work permit has already expired. So either the work permit has to be valid or they have already applied for renewal. So when you've already applied for renewal, you have implied status, meaning that you will have status until a decision has been made on the renewal application. So the bottom line is that you can apply for the open work permit for vulnerable workers while you still have status. So proof of abuse that you can include, that can include a letter, statement, or report from an organization, a medical doctor, any other healthcare professional. An affidavit is usually very, very helpful, especially if you don't have other kinds of proof of abuse. Usually an affidavit is very strong evidence. You could include a copy of an official complaint form filed with an enforcement agency, or other documents such as victim impact statements, email messages, photos showing injuries, witness testimonies. So anything that can show that you have been abused, or a person has been abused or is at risk of abuse. These work permits are supposed to be, in theory, they're supposed to be processed urgently. So it takes about 5 days for IRCC to contact the applicant. But what we have to be mindful about is that these work permits are temporary. So usually they're given for about a year. And it's supposed to be a transitional measure, actually. It's not any kind of long-term solution for somebody who's facing abuse or is at risk of abuse, because it does have an expiry date and it cannot be renewed. So what this open work permit for vulnerable workers is meant to do is to give people the time to find a new job and apply for a new work permit. And you have to apply for the new work permit before this open work permit expires. So here are some of the challenges with this particular work permit. So it's not available for people who are out of status, because you have to apply while your closed work permit is still valid or you have applied for renewal. And of course, with language and technology barriers, people will often refrain from applying. And again, the other barriers of not knowing what your legal rights are, not being able to access legal services or advice from a lawyer in a timely fashion, especially in a trafficking situation, you can see how that becomes extremely challenging. Often people may not have the proof of abuse. And essentially what happens is, once you are applying for the new work permit, when you're getting out of this transitional period and you're applying for a new work permit, you're essentially going back to the closed work permit situation. So now you have to find a new employer with an LMIA. And so now you're basically going back to the closed work permit scenario. The other option that victims of trafficking in persons have is what we call a temporary resident permit for victims of trafficking in persons. So this is a specific permit that the government has introduced to assist people who are in trafficking situations. So before I talk about the specific permit, I want to talk about what the TRPs are in general. So a temporary resident permit, or a TRP, is a permit that allows a person who is inadmissible to Canada to enter or remain in Canada on a temporary basis if it's justified in the circumstances. Now, people can be inadmissible under immigration law for a number of reasons. It basically means that you're not allowed to come to Canada. So, if there's been security violations, for example, if there are, issues around terrorism, or there are human rights violations such as war crimes or other crimes, including organized crimes, if you have medical conditions that would create an excessive burden on the Canadians' healthcare system. If you are on social assistance, you could be financially inadmissible, or, if you haven't complied with any part of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, you could also be inadmissible, or if you have a family member that's inadmissible, right? So these are scenarios under which you are inadmissible, and you may be eligible to apply for a temporary resident permit. Now, the temporary resident permit for people who are trafficked specifically, it's for people who are out of status, and it was introduced by the government to provide protection to people who have been internationally trafficked and who would, of course, otherwise be inadmissible to Canada. It was established to assist victims or survivors of trafficking by securing their immigration status with a special fee-exempt permit. So normally a TRP would cost about $200. I think that's the fee for TRP. But for the initial TRP that the victims of trafficking in persons would be eligible to apply for is fee exempt. So there's no fee involved. And what this TRP does is it allows trafficked people to remain legally in Canada for 180 days, but there's a possibility of extension. The purpose of this TRP is to give the trafficked person some time to escape the influence of the traffickers, or give them some time to reflect on what their options are. Is it reasonable or safe for them to return home? What are their options of staying in Canada? It also gives them it's meant to give the victim of trafficking to decide if they want to assist in any kind of investigation of the trafficker, or, if they want to be involved. And then it also allows the victim to recover from physical or mental trauma. So those are some of the reasons, or some of the, purposes of this TRP. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that just because somebody is applying for this TRP doesn't mean that they're required to testify against their trafficker if there is a criminal proceeding that's going on. They are entitled to interim federal health coverage, which includes medical treatment and counseling services. And people who apply for TRP are also entitled to an open work permit. Some of the challenges about this program is that the person has to establish that they have been trafficked. And this is something that's very difficult to do. Often people will not self-identify as someone who has been trafficked, or they may not recognize that they have been trafficked. So they may not be able to articulate properly what is happening to them. There's often an ongoing criminal investigation that's required to be able to assess whether this person has been trafficked. And it's at the discretion of the IRCC officer, right? So even though the numbers, there have been, large numbers of trafficking cases in Canada, compared to that, the number of TRPs have not been that many. So that goes to show that perhaps, we don't really know how helpful this program has been in identifying people who are being trafficked. And there's also no viable pathway to permanent residence from this TRP. So I guess the other option we can consider is a refugee claim. So in Canada, a person can claim refugee status if they are afraid of being persecuted in their home country. So there has to be a well-founded fear of persecution. And if someone gets refugee status, they can work and live in Canada and get healthcare, and eventually they can apply for permanent residence. So once they're accepted as refugees, they can go ahead and apply for PR. There are 5 grounds to base a claim for refugee status. So the fear of persecution has to be based on either someone's race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group. So often this includes people who are facing gender-based violence or, LGBTQ individuals, or if you have a certain political opinion, if you're persecuted based on that. So those are the 5 grounds based on which you can claim refugee status. The issue with this is that human trafficking often does not easily fall within the parameters of refugee determination, because you have to show persecution in the country of origin, which is not often easy to do. Often people come here and then the exploitation begins, right? So, and then what we have seen is that a lot of trafficking victims or survivors are actually pushed or forced to make a refugee claim by their traffickers so that they're able to receive social assistance, which ultimately benefits the trafficker. And then what often ends up happening is the claims are abandoned or lost because the claimant is still under the influence of the trafficker, or they're not ready to share their experience with the Immigration and Refugee Board. So once the refugee claim fails, there's a short deadline within which they have to apply, they have to appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division. And if they don't do that, then they've basically lost their options, or they could also apply to the federal court for a judicial review of a negative refugee appeal decision. But oftentimes, a person who's in a trafficking situation will not be aware of those options, and they will simply fall out of status. And even though they may have the option of applying for a humanitarian and compassionate application, which I'll be talking about next, failed refugee claimants are not eligible to apply for until 1 year after the claim has failed. The only exception to this is if there's a risk to life due to lack of adequate medical care in the home country, or if there's an adverse effect on the best interest of a child. So those are the exceptions to the 1 year bar. So you can see how there are a lot of challenges and limitations in the option of making a refugee claim. So the last thing I want to discuss is the humanitarian and compassionate application. So this is actually an application for permanent residence. Now, the general rule is that people apply for permanent residence from outside of Canada, but the H&C application is an exemption. What it does is it allows people to apply from inside Canada and ask the government to grant PR or permanent residence based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So some of the factors that are considered in an H&C application is how established are you in Canada? So if somebody has lived in Canada for a very long time, even if they may be out of status, if they have gone to school here, if they have worked here, if they have family here, especially if they have Canadian-born children here, if they have a support system of relatives, that shows establishment and ties to Canada. Another factor that's considered is the best interests of children. So how would the best interests of a child involved be affected if a person is removed and is asked to apply for permanent residence from outside of Canada? Are there any family violence scenarios? And what are the country conditions? So a lot of times the conditions in the country, in the home country, are such that it's not possible for a person to go back and apply from outside of Canada. So this could include a poor justice system, inadequate medical care, safety issues. Those are some of the things that could fall under the category of adverse country conditions, and also discrimination. So what the applicants have to show is that they will face hardship if they return to their home country and apply from outside. So humanitarian and compassionate applications require very, very strong submissions. So you really have to, because it is an exceptional measure, so it's not granted that easily. So it's crucial to get help from an experienced lawyer who will write strong submissions on the applicant's behalf. The arguments have to be very strong. And what I do with my clients, and it's advisable for any lawyer who's working on an H&C application, is to get an affidavit detailing the experience of exploitation and abuse, and that's often going to be key. And you have to provide supporting documents, for example, articles and reports on country conditions, support letters from community members, family, friends, organizations that the person may have volunteered with, letters from employers, doctors' letters and reports, police reports, and other kinds of proof of employment, education, and volunteer history. Again, you can see that in a trafficking situation, you may not always be able to show strong establishment in Canada, because a person who's being trafficked will, in many cases, will not have, proof of education or stable employment. So in the submissions, it's very important to make that connection between the lack of establishment and the human trafficking experience. And the other challenge is that there is a $550 fee involved. And H&C applications have very long processing times. So it could take more than a year for an H&C application to be processed. And the other shortcoming of an H&C application is that it actually does not stop removal. So while an H&C application is processing, a person may be removed, but if they're accepted, they will be able to come back to Canada. And there are two stages of approval. So the first stage of approval is called approval in principle. So once you get that approval, you are able to apply for a work permit, but before that, you won't be able to. So those are some of the options and challenges for people who are experiencing or at risk of being trafficked in Canada under immigration law. So that ends my presentation, and I've included some important resources that you can look into if you are supporting somebody who may be at risk of trafficking, being trafficked, or is being trafficked, or if you are going through this experience. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.